Well, good evening, everyone, and we would like to welcome you here to ASPI for the launch of our research paper, Benchmarking Critical Technologies, Building an Evidence Base for an Informed Critical Technology Strategy. Now, before I start tonight, I would like to recognise the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and acknowledge our past and present. So my name is Carly Winkler. I am a senior analyst with the International Cyber Policy Centre here at ASPI, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I am sure this is going to be a very interesting discussion, and hopefully that we'll get a lot of questions. I certainly have a lot of questions. So as the technology landscape has been changing, we've come to critically depend on a new range of emerging technologies, and that provides some really exciting opportunities, but also some real challenges and risks to both our national security and interests in general. As we seek international partnerships to address these challenges together, such as the cooperation between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, it's really important if we can bring some scientific rigour to how we align our strategic plans with our technical endeavours, and to find opportunities to best use our strengths with our partners and to be able to offset our weaknesses. Of course, no assessment is complete without including a comparison with China, given that they are a technological powerhouse and a key strategic influence in the region. But in this paper, we begin by assessing our development plans against 4 key critical technologies, and they are 2 renewable energy technologies, solar, photovoltaic, and hydrogen energy, and 2 medical technologies, genetic engineering and vaccines and medical countermeasures. So today I am delighted to introduce you to an extremely distinguished panel of guests. To start with, on my left here, we have Professor Tanya Monro. She is the Chief Defence Scientist, and in this role is the head of the Defence Science and Technology Group and Capability Manager for Innovation, Science and Technology within the Australian Department of Defence. She also has a long and distinguished career as a research scientist specialising in photonics, sensing, lasers and optical fibres. Next to Tanya is Ms. Louise Talbot, who is the Deputy Coordinator for Critical Technology and Policy Coordination Office in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Here, Louise has overseen the development of Australia's first blueprint and action plan for critical technologies, including delivering Australia's first public list of critical technologies in the national interest. So Louise also has an extensive background in developing technology, policy and innovation strategies for the Australian government. Next on our panel is Dr. Samantha Hoffman, who is a senior analyst at the International Cyber Policy Centre and author of the Benchmarking Critical Technologies paper. She is a subject matter expert in politics and international relations, Chinese language and culture, and her work explores the domestic and global implications of the Chinese Communist Party's approach to state security and their pursuit of advanced technologies to augment political and social control. Sam's analysis is widely sought after with governments around the world. She has provided expert testimony in both the US Congress and the UK House of Commons, and is regularly quoted on too many international media outlets to name. And it is our pleasure to have online today from Tokyo in Japan, Mr. Bunro Shiozawa, the Innovation Strategy Coordinator of Energy Management, Cross-ministerial Strategic Innovation Promotion Program in Japan. Mr. Shiozawa also serves as an advisor to Japan's Intellectual Property Standards Office, has chaired international groups on energy and climate change, and has extensive expertise leading technical programs for the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry in the space of decarbonised energy and energy carriers. In fact, his most recent report is on the implementation of a carbon neutral strategy, electrification, hydrogen and ammonia for Japan, which is clearly extremely relevant to our topic today. So we'll kick off. What's going to happen tonight is that we will first discuss some of the topics of the paper with panel session, and then we'll open the questions for the group. If anyone in the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll have someone come out with a microphone. And if you are online, please put a question in the chat box. So to start with, I'm going to throw to Sam as author of the Benchmarking Critical Tech project. Sam, tell us about the development of this research paper. What were some of the challenges? What do the results mean?
Sure. So when I started this paper, we had a very big ask. We were asked to look at the leaders across 4 critical technologies and think about where they, originally we were going to think about where they ranked against each other in terms of meeting strategic objectives. But as the project evolved, we ended up deciding that we would focus on the Quad in China specifically, and we'd look at where each country was in terms of meeting their own strategic objective with each of the technologies. Because of course, developments in Japan, India, the US, Australia, they could be very different, but it doesn't mean that one is behind the other if their strategic objectives are different. But of course, the challenge there is that with all countries, maybe a lot of the policy discussion around why each technology is relevant would be at a different stage. And so we had to, think about what would be, I guess we're looking at data that is perhaps a little bit more, or I guess less connected to the policy objectives themselves. So we were looking for ways to try to explain, I think, and accurately benchmark each country to each technology. So that was quite a challenge, but we ended up through a lot of assistance through IP Australia in particular, I'd like to thank. We looked at patent data, we looked at academic output, and we tried to look at investment, but that was a little bit too hard to compare across each country. So instead, we included that also in the summary about the development of policy for each technology. And we looked at, we put the data through your help, Carly, through Elasticsearch, as well as a tool from LexisNexis called PatentSite, where we're able to judge patent quality. And through all of that, able to make our assessments about each. So I won't go into too much detail because we have plenty of time. And of course, also we had a number of subject matter experts who are also listed on the, or country experts who are listed on the page as well. One right here, Bonnie Growell from, who worked on the India component and did a lot of interviews for us. We conducted interviews across the Quad, and also Saki Kikuchi in Japan and others. So it's a general overview of a very big project.
Indeed, it's a very big project. So, China has invested heavily in their technology industry. They, long term, what did you find specifically about how they're positioning on these kinds of critical technologies, and how do we?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
How does China line up on these critical technologies?
It was an interesting country to compare to the others, because if you looked at, say, patent output, the number of patents that China's producing across each of the technologies is quite high compared to other countries. But according to the LexisNexis tool, the quality of those patents was quite low. And the quality was measured mostly in terms of the market impact of those patents. But another main author of the report, and Kitch Liao, we looked at that and we thought, well, doesn't necessarily mean that China's not meeting its strategic objectives with those technologies, because actually China's approach to innovation is quite different, and the R&D ecosystem is quite different. So while the data might be telling us that, okay, China has a high number of patents, but not necessarily having a huge impact, that means that maybe PRC patents aren't having a huge impact on the overall field and the development of the field, but it doesn't mean that China's behind in terms of meeting strategic objectives. Whereas a country like Australia had very few patents, but then those patents had a much higher impact in the overall field. But we didn't necessarily see that those patents were translating into the necessary capabilities to meet policy objectives either. So in a sense, our data was extremely useful for getting a picture of what the landscape was, but you need to have more in-depth policy knowledge and country knowledge in particular to really understand what that means. For China, in particular, I think that could be quite misleading if you assumed that innovation isn't working.
So China, I guess they have quite a different approach to innovation too, in terms of like iterative development. Do you think that was also partly responsible for those numbers of patents that they were releasing?
Yeah, and I think a difference in China anyway, and this is somewhat outside of the scope of what we wrote in the report, but I've looked a lot at standards development in the PRC, for instance, and when you look at the way that technical standards are set for technologies, and there are technical committees that are companies working with government and as well as research institutes to develop the technical standards that meet the government's needs. And technologies are developed to meet those needs, and then they're exported. And so, in a sense, the way that R&D is happening in China is actually directly responding to the policy needs, and not the other way around.
Awesome, thank you. Well, right, we'll throw over to our other panelists. So, Louise, I'm going to throw to you next, given that you have such an extensive experience in trying to build and implement good policy around technology issues. I know that I personally have really appreciated the list of national critical technologies, because it's been really difficult to define exactly what we're talking about when relating to critical technologies and emerging technologies. That term gets used a lot. So how did you go about determining what should be on that list, and what do those technologies then mean to Australia?
So thank you. So the list of critical technologies in the national interest was developed, as you say, to assist with the identification of critical technologies in the national interest, pretty much between now and within the next 10-year timeframe. So in order to develop that list, we have been through an extensive process, starting with our Defence Science and Technology group colleagues, and also with the Critical Technology Policy Office. And initially, a list was developed based on existing technology lists from across government and key international partners. That underwent a first round of extensive consultation across both the Commonwealth Government, the research and academic sector, who've been very generous with their time in helping us with this process, and with the industry, and in particular extensive consultation with the agriculture and health sectors. So we took on board that first round of feedback, which primarily focused on the sort of granularity and the explanation of the technologies. There's a lot of different ways you can characterise them. And then the list was revised, and we undertook a further round of targeted consultation in September this year, again across government, research, academia, National Science and Technology Council, who advised the government, or facilitated by Australia's chief scientist, and industry via existing government advisory bodies, and also with ASPI yourselves. So thank you. And so we took on board that feedback, and we've come up with a list of 63 technologies which or have the capacity to be used in many different ways, with many having implications for defence and security, but often also having much broader applications. So the list provides a guidance and a clear signal about the critical technologies that have a national interest implications for Australia today, as I said, and within the next 10 years. And we're hoping that the list is part of government's overall guidance and assistance to broader society, academia and industry to build the right skills and tools to efficiently and effectively adopt critical technologies in a safe and secure manner. The government's overall policy for critical technologies is to both promote and protect critical technologies on that list.
So now that we've got the list, how do we measure how we're doing, and what kind of information do we collect to create metrics?
So that's a really great question, and again, the work that Sam has been leading here at ASPI is a great piece of work that definitely advances all of our understanding in that area. Again, I'm going to shout out to our Defence Science and Technology colleagues who've been absolutely instrumental in the work that we've been doing to develop good evidence, good data and good metrics to advance our understanding of critical technologies, as well as how we're performing. It's a very challenging space, and I think Samantha has already outlined some of those challenges already, but certainly some of the challenges we've encountered in getting good data and good metrics are around the sort of rapidly evolving nature of critical technologies. It means some of your more traditional indicators, such as the publication data, may not be providing that early signalling. the inherent complexities in just one critical technology, you've looked at 4, means that the definitions and taxonomies of what's actually being measured in that technology can be very complex to put together. It's quite a bit of work to build that in the first place, and then they can vary markedly across international systems, again, I think as Sam has highlighted there. And again, the quality part of the indicators is also important. Research outputs, patents, there's relatively good metrics on quantity, but when you want to look at some form of a quality adjusted metric about the use or the application, that can be challenging as well. So we're sort of working to try to find solutions to these challenges, and the work that ASPI's presented here today does advance that, particularly on the patent asset index. And I think that steps forward all of our understanding on the patent data, which is really, really important. And we are continuing to work with Defence Science and Technology to develop additional tools to help us to measure the momentum of technologies appearing in the academic and scientific literature, and other types of metrics to help us understand this very complex space.
Thank you so much, Louise. So across to you, Tanya. In addition to having the mantle of Chief Defence Scientist, of course, you're also a research scientist in photonics, and you probably have a better understanding than we do about how Australia produces some really great research. And we certainly found that as part of our research project, that Australia is producing some world-leading research across all sorts of different technology fields. Defence is also on the cutting edge of leading, the development path for a number of these kinds of technologies. But as a scientist, what can policy do to enable great research to be pulled through? And is it just a matter of the policy side get out of the way, or do we really need to set some guardrails and guidelines about how this is going to go?
Oh, what a rich question! I could take that for the whole rest of this time, but I won't. Let me start by saying I think that the quality of research happening in many critical technology areas in Australia is outstanding and is one of our very significant assets. But I certainly don't advocate that policy should get out of the way. My view is that policy has a really critical role to play, and for too long Australia has shied away from setting priorities. I think this whole conversation about critical technologies changes the landscape. And the fact that we're looking at it from both the opportunity for our national interests, but also the threat to our national interests, and that we're doing it in a way that I think sets us up very well to work internationally, and I can talk more about that, means that we're now starting to talk about areas we do need to prioritise. And my view is the role of policy can be to articulate the requirements we have nationally, the requirements government has, to really bridge the market failure. Because one of the biggest challenges we have in Australia is the mismatch between our R&D base and our industry capacity to commercialise and pull through. And while there has been much focus, particularly from government in recent years and in recent months and weeks with announcements on trying to put some policies in place to try and address research commercialisation challenges in Australia, I think fundamentally, if we have the courage as a nation to articulate some areas that are national priorities that align with our critical technology needs, that's the role policy can play in shifting. I love the language you used in the report, shifting some of the great ideas, the concepts into capabilities. In terms of how we connect policy with science, I think probably the most fundamental thing we need to do is increase the mobility and the porosity of the people. While we still have a world where policy people have always been policy people and feel that scientists are a little bit strange and vice versa, and our scientists don't go into government or in industry, I think we'll struggle to bring those worlds together. And so I think a real focus on how you build understanding between policy folk, research folk, and industry is really critical.
So how do we get everyone together on this and again, make sure that industry, academia, government are all standing together on some of these key policy issues?
I think it's pretty simple. I think you have missions. I think you increase the leaning towards mission-directed research. I mean, that's what we're doing in defence with our star shots. There are 8 big, hairy problems that our chiefs of our services know we don't have the science and technology to deliver now. where we need great ideas wherever they come from, and then we need some lubrication, we need some funding and the policy settings to put that through. I think you can't underestimate the international here. What I'm seeing is a real shift in international conversations, whether that be Five Eyes, whether it be Quad, whether it be AUKUS or bilateral, to really go beyond token description of enhanced mutual reliance to deeper understanding of enhanced mutual reliance. So there now are things we're doing with partners, either multilaterally or bilaterally, where countries that previously would have had a position of saying, we work with partners, we form compatible alliances, but we don't rely on partners for key technologies, who are now seeing issues to their supply chains or their ability to ramp up fast enough, and are leaning in more deeply into that enhanced mutual reliance. So I think that's another key factor.
Well, there certainly seems to be the appetite from government to do it with, the Quad agreements on the technologies that we're going to collaborate on, and initiatives such as AUKUS, where we're really looking at some of those deep technical issues and looking at how we can do it to support our partners in the Indo-Pacific region and with ASEAN. So hopefully that will get some momentum.
Well, one thing I think is really exciting there is if you take some of those concepts and pull them together. So missions, if you take a mission to be an articulation of a problem that you need to solve, usually with some critical technologies that underpin it, and can develop a position with international alliances for where Australia has real strength. And that's what I value in this report, is an attempt to make this more fact-based about where strengths really lie. It creates opportunity for Australian industry, because then their market is not just our nation or defence, for example, but their market then becomes that alliance network.
Thank you very much. I'll throw over now to our distinguished guest from Tokyo, Shiozawa-san. First of all, as an expert in energy technologies, please talk to us about what challenges are facing Japan in the broader energy sector, and how hydrogen energy plays a role in that.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, of course, Japan they promised to make this economy as a carbon neutral by the year 2050. So that's why the urgent task of not only the government but also industries to decarbonize their production system or economic system. So that's why we are very much active to introduce the renewables, but unfortunately, our country is not well endowed with renewable energy. That's why we are looking at the potential to be on the hydrogen energy, because hydrogen energy can bring the renewable energy to for a long distance. That's why now the Japanese, one of the emphasis of Japanese government put on in its energy policy is to introduce hydrogen energy into the Japanese energy system, particularly hydrogen energy for the power generation, the fuel. So in this situation, if I may make a comment on the report, I would like to deploy two things. Is this a right time to make comments on the report?
Yes, please, by all means.
Okay. Then I have two comments on the report. The first thing I would like to point out is that, particularly on the hydrogen, your hydrogen on the report. The first, I would like to point out the versatility or diversity of hydrogen energy supply chain. Depending on use, the amount and distance that hydrogen energy must be transported, the best form of hydrogen energy is different. If you transport hydrogen energy for short distance and in a small amount, you can use hydrogen as it is to transport hydrogen energy. But if you need to transport a large amount of hydrogen energy for a long distance, for example, for the use as a power generation fuel, you need to transport hydrogen energy in the form of ammonia or other hydrogen-based fuels. This is because hydrogen itself is very difficult to transport due to its extremely low volumetric energy density and other physical chemical properties. But the hydrogen is a molecule, and hydrogen can be combined with other elements, such as nitrogen, to make the ammonia that are easier to transport and handle. Therefore, the country like Japan, which is not well endowed with the renewable energy resources, not connected by transmission lines nor gas pipelines with resource-rich countries or regions, is aiming at introducing green ammonia as a power generation fuel to decarbonize its electricity. So when considering supply chain security of the hydrogen energy, you must define and supply context of hydrogen energy, and then choose relevant form of hydrogen energy to consider the matter. So I read the report of your report, when you mentioned that you picked up the hydrogen as one of the critical technology. But depending on the scope of definition of hydrogen in your report, I think the research outcome would be applicable to the real world or not. Second comment is that production technologies of hydrogen energy are, generally speaking, very conventional ones. Although there is still room to advance in those technologies, they are not high-tech. So production technology would not be a matter of security concern, I think. But from security point of view, supply chain security, that is sea lane security, would be more critical for a country like Japan, which must rely hydrogen energy supply on overseas countries. So I see the security matter with regard to the hydrogen is not related to production technology, but how we can transport large amount of hydrogen to Japan. That's my comments on the report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So you highlight there that transport of stable ammonia to Japan could actually be a really good opportunity for Australia and Japan to collaborate.
Yes, of course. Well, that's why I think now between the governments, Australian government and Japanese government, as well as the companies, both Japanese companies and Australian companies are engaged in the sort of discussion or negotiation. In what terms the Japan can do this large amount of green ammonia from Australia?
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I'll jump over now to some general questions for the panel, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. But I'll start with a question about, I guess, our relative sophistication level in Australia on some of these technologies. So we noted in the report that Australia tended to be more advanced on medical technologies than over the energy technologies, and there's probably like a lot of reasons for that. It's a very established industry, has been for a long time. There is a single master from the Department of Health guiding the policy direction and initiatives and funding. There's also a single political focus for energy through the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, but that's sort of hopped around a little bit in different portfolios over the years. And I'm curious as to whether the panel thinks that that's had an impact on our energy policies and our ability to align policy and the technologies. Or do we really think it's just more about awareness of government, the raising of renewable energy is such a key political issue in recent days? I don't ask easy questions, but again, I have a long list of questions that I'd really like to hear your opinions on.
think there's a range of factors, and I'll throw a little bit in and pass to colleagues. I think one factor here is that the nature of Australia's R&D ecosystem is that there is a relative overweighting, I would argue, to health and medical research in the broader ecosystem. Not to say that it isn't high value, high quality, and that success rates for things like NHMRC grants aren't challenging for researchers. But relative to the scale of our industry or our ability to pull things through, it is relatively well funded compared to all other fields of endeavour. The other thing I would say is that that traditionally the incentives that have faced our universities, which do the bulk of the R&D in this country, and the proportions of R&D done in our universities is significantly higher here than in a lot of the countries you compare us to in the report. The incentives push towards the kind of high research impact type work that drives rankings, which tends to be more easily secured through health and medical research than it does through engineering type research.
So, I mean, how do we do this on technologies where there is not a good public understanding, such as quantum artificial intelligence, and there may be no clear home for that kind of technology given the breadth of impact that could have? Do you have insights on thoughts about how we can do that, and what we might need to do more broadly from a policy perspective to get that running and commercialised in a similar way?
So I might jump in on that one. So I think the technologies you mentioned there are exceptionally important and incredibly ubiquitous. They sit across almost every sector. The applications of those technologies are certainly evolving and still to evolve, and so they're much harder to sort of define. I mean, and you know, in the area of medical research, there's enormous amount of complexity as well. But medical research is something that's very easily understandable. It's going to help human health. And obviously, in the last 2 years, well, I now know what genomic sequencing is, and I didn't before. So, and certainly in the last 2 years, that's even raising what something like AI, something like quantum, where the applications are still evolving and so cross-cutting. I think it is a little more challenging. So certainly one of the ways that the government is approaching that is certainly with the launch of the Blueprint and Action Plan for Critical Technologies. The Prime Minister announced that Australia would be establishing a quantum strategy for Australia, which will look at all of these different areas of applications and things that we might need to do, and that will be led by Dr. Kathy Foley, Australia's Chief Scientist. We have, the government as a whole has released an AI action plan, which is covering off on various sort of things that need to be done in AI. I think it's going to take a little while to sort of continue to evolve, but that's certainly a very good step, is to set those strategies, to look at what those applications are. And I think once the applications are a bit more developed, it becomes a little bit easier for people to understand. And then particular sectors like the health sector, AI, quantum, potentially they have applications there too. They will pick those technologies up too.
If I may just give an example that follows on from that, because I think it connects your answer, Louise, with my earlier broad point about mission-directed research, because if I pick the area of quantum sensing technology, where Australia has some real strengths in terms of its R&D and indeed its SME ecosystem, by setting the challenge that we wanted to bring together some of those technologies to demonstrate quantum-assured position, navigation and timing in a military context, we now have exercises next year and in 2024 that are essentially bringing together alliance partners globally and Australia's best to demonstrate prototype systems for doing exactly that in a maritime environment. So I think having that hard problem and providing that sort of resourcing lubrication to say, well, it's not about giving you funding just to do your research. It's about you bringing your toys and showing they can work in the context and pushing their development to a timeline. Yeah, I think that changes the dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the PNT work that DST is leading on quantum assured navigation timing is a super interesting example too, because it really helps a lot of different sectors other than defence, particularly around assurance of GPS security, which again is, as a technology, is very ubiquitous. It's built into a bunch of technology everyone across the world uses in a range of sectors, but is also extremely vulnerable because the signal is so weak and they can be jammed very, very easily.
And it's a great example of how this kind of strategy can work, because the bulk of the expertise we're bringing is from partners. It's from companies, it's from allies. What we provide in the sort of the magic sauce from DST Group is the deep understanding of the technical and the defence context to allow that integration and demonstration.
Yeah.
In
So
that
I guess
particular area.
having that alignment with the problem domain then is sort of the really critical and success in that case.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Excellent. How do I even go through the set of questions? Is there anyone here who would like to ask a question? Let me just check the online people because I can't see that immediately. So we have an online question from Aston. So they ask, while there are clear advantages to the state-driven strategic approach to technology innovation by China, I wonder if you can see any flaws or pitfalls in the approach. Sam, I think that's probably a question for you.
Flaws or pitfalls? Well, I think that I guess it depends on what perspective you're looking at it from. From the state's perspective, I don't necessarily see the pitfalls as much, because I think that the state is quite clear in articulating what its objectives are, but obviously it's undermining the R&D ecosystem. And I don't think it would be an advantage, say, for the Quad to adopt similar strategy. But, you know, I think especially across, perhaps in the next year as we expand this project, we'll be able to look a little bit more in depth at the patents in China and think a little bit more, because it's a side comment, but I think currently our understanding of the innovation ecosystem in China tends to be a little bit too mirror imaged, and we tend to, and that happens across a lot of issue areas on China research, but I don't know that we can look at that and say, well, they aren't succeeding in their goals, or that our opinions of what is positive or negative would necessarily be the same from the party's perspective. That being said, you know, in terms of advancing an entire field of research and participating in the what do I say, global advancement of a particular technology, I don't know that that's what China's achieving, but I also don't know that that's what is intended, because we're trying to very specifically focus on the strategic applications or the policy relevance of each technology rather than the field itself in this report, and that's how we were limiting what we were doing. So, otherwise, probably too big for a couple of people to take on.
Yep, absolutely. That's a huge question.
Yeah.
So I guess on the flip side, where the Chinese state is in a position to direct strategic policy in a way that is very clearly executed by the technology sector. On the flip side, we have the United States, where the technology sector tends to take a leading role and you know, make advances in technology spaces, and then the policy kind of catches up a little bit. I guess, do you have any insights as to which is better? Is there a happy? I feel like there's a happy medium we can find in there somewhere.
I'll just go with the comfortable answer and say there must be a happy medium. But I think that you know, the biggest problem for the Quad anyway is just making sure that collaboration is taking place between industry researchers and government, and making sure that there is a clear conversation. Because for us, it's, you know, especially for me as a China specialist working on this report, I look at AI, I look at big data. I don't look at hydrogen energy, or I don't look at biotech in my normal research. And so for me, even just coming up with how do we define this and what's the limit of the study was quite a challenge. And so we need to be able to do that effectively. And I think on the policy side, you know, decision makers, policy advisors need to feel comfortable talking about tech issues, and that's not happening. And vice versa for researchers and for industry, there needs to be comfort in talking to policymakers and understanding where they're coming from as well. And I think there's improvements on that, but obviously that needs to happen more.
So I guess as we collaborate with international partners and we have diplomats going out and building relationships with our partners on deeply technical issues, how do we build and support their ability to do technology diplomacy? Where we are able to help them, help provide some of the technology expertise and the industry understanding about where the dependencies and vulnerabilities are in a way that helps them build and support relationships with other countries.
Can I start? on that?
Please.
I think the first thing is not assume that they're starting from scratch.
Mhm.
So certainly, in the defence science context, we have many, many decades of deep foundational Five Eyes partnership through the TTCP program, for example, with a very deep understanding of where the strengths of all of those nations are. Really fast emerging relationships with Japan, Singapore, Korea, India, so that deep understanding of what the other nations do is a sort of a real national jewel I think we have here. And in the national security space, the 5RD research alliance to gives us that foundation to work on. And we have, through our different public institutions, whether that be DST Group, CSIRO, some of our, people placed around the world that can provide that type of advice to diplomats on that underpinning infrastructure.
I might throw a question over to Shiozawa-san in Tokyo. So in terms of building our relationship from a technology perspective with Japan, we understand that there's a new Minister for Economic Security. What does this role involve and what does it have a technical focus? How can Australia and Japan work most effectively together?
I think the primary interest is to maintain or enhance the supply chain of industry supply chains of Japan. Of course, that includes differentiated technologies as well. Very typical example is he has a very much concern on secure the supply of the semiconductor. That's why Japanese government decided to subsidize more than, I think, $40 billion in subsidies to Taiwanese semiconductor fabrication manufacturers. That's quite exceptional. I mean, we haven't had that kind of policy before. So because of the supply disruption of the semiconductor, Japanese government has come to recognize that keep the supply chain of the semiconductor is so critical. And it also, because of the COVID-19, many parts and equipment supplier in the Southeast Asian countries have been damaged because of the COVID-19. So that's why also that caused the automobile industry to stop their manufacturing or the production of the cars. So therefore, I think the new minister is very much interested in secure the supply chain of the Japanese industry activities. Also, as you know, that Japan is relying on many important natural resources, including energy resources and the metal resources outside Japan. So to secure that those supply chains and the critical issues. So that's why I think those areas are the primary interest of the Minister of Japan, deeply specialized for the economic security.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's a really key point about semiconductor fabrication, and it must be, a very critical issue for Japan because you have such a advanced electronics sector. I think Australia is only just starting to understand what a challenge that is going to be for us because we don't tend to manufacture our own. But we would very much like to make sure that that our Japanese partners have an assured supply chain of semiconductors. So we have a question online from Steve. So where would you rank the different nations with study on progress towards delivering against their strategy? So what Australia needs to do to accelerate progress in developing and employing critical technologies? I guess this gets back to your point, Sam, on the fact that ranking was very difficult and maybe a little bit arbitrary because we're not ranking how sophisticated particular tech sectors were or particular policies were. I guess, can you talk about the ranking a little bit?
Yeah, the ranking was very difficult, and the reason is that because we were in looking at the metrics and looking at the policy, obviously neither are designed to be joined up.
Yeah.
And so we tried to, and that's why we didn't want to compare, and I want to be clear, especially if you've got a copy of the report in front of me, you'll see that each of the countries are on the graph together, but we aren't comparing them against each other. Again, it's against their own strategic objectives. And what we found was that, is that the Australia in particular was somewhat in the middle for most, and in terms of the research capacity is there, the innovation is there, but not necessarily connecting that to commercial gain, and not necessarily connecting to the policy objectives. And I think actually most countries sort of sat in that right in the middle. The policy objectives were there, the research capacity was there, not necessarily linking up. I think the US and China tended on more technologies to be on the upper end, but not all of them. The one I'm looking at right now, China's sort of below Australia, for instance. Well, they're against each other, but to be clear, but in terms of meeting their own objectives, and this is just throwing this out there, and I don't know if it's true, but one thing that I thought with the US is maybe part of that has to do with DARPA, for instance. For China, again, we've sort of outlined where the party state is quite clear in outlining what it wants to achieve with technologies, and particularly with the two sectors that we looked at. The plans tended to go back a number of years, if not over a decade, whereas for other countries, the plans tended to be within the last 2 years, or the kinds of plans that we were able to draw on and say, okay, this policy document said that this is the goal. And if
a really interesting thing there, though, is what does it take in terms of policy consistency and time to impact? Because a lot of these areas are quite deep tech.
Yeah,
and can't turn on a dime. So I think that's a really interesting angle to explore.
Exactly, and even with the sort of data that we're looking at on research and patents, we know that that's not necessarily, with research, we know that in academia it takes a long time to publish, and so where research is now versus what we were looking at in the data, two different things. With patents, it was not necessarily true that all patents are even published, or so that's or not published, but I'm probably getting the terminology wrong, and I feel a bit ashamed here, but it's more that some companies might not publish their IP in order to protect it more.
So we certainly noticed a difference in the research paper about time taken to publish patents. So China had a very, very fast release cycle that was usually about half the amount of time that it took the rest of the world to do it. We spent a little bit of time looking at that as an issue and trying to figure out whether that meant they were more efficient at getting technologies to market. But it appeared that after I guess some expert consultation with IP Australia, who were extremely helpful in providing input into this research, we actually discovered that was a semi-desirable property from technology companies who wanted time to evolve their products before actually committing to them in public and before releasing all of their designs. So it became really difficult to use some of those measurements to determine what good looked like and what was most effective. I think we just found it was different.
Yeah.
And we can probably speculate a lot as to what that means.
With China in particular, with what we were looking at, we thought, well, maybe, and maybe we'll see this is more true across, say, big data technologies, AI, is that if the companies are owning the market first and then the product eventually catches up with the idea, then that also would put, in terms of global competitiveness and strategic objectives, that will put China ahead, or at least on, in terms of achieving its objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have some questions in the room, which is wonderful. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Damien McLaughlin. My question is about the quality of the papers. So you mentioned in there about the number of papers. There's been comments in the past that a lot of the Chinese papers were, I'll say this incorrect, mass-produced or copied, and therefore they were just producing papers for the sake of it. Did you have any look at what the quality of the paper is and the quality of the patents, or were we just looking at the number themselves? Thank you.
So with the patents in particular, our thinking was that a lot of them were patenting specific applications of technology. So again, the way that maybe the metrics, and we use patent site, but maybe the way that patent quality is judged there isn't, it's useful, and it was really useful for us, but it doesn't necessarily capture what's happening in China if the R&D ecosystem is different and the innovation ecosystem is different. So with papers, we didn't have that same ability to measure. And I think that was one of the challenges of this project is knowing that there are a lot of these other factors. And so we tried to limit what we were trying to do in the paper in order to address those kinds of factors.
So there was certainly, I guess, metrics on that with the patent site impact index that used a bunch of factors, including how many subsequent child patents came from the original patent as to what kind of an impact it had had, how broadly that had been published, how much it had been used and accessed, and tying that to research papers that were also associated with those patents. So how much of an impact those papers had had in terms of being quoted in other papers. So there are metrics to assess the impact of some of those patents. It's just a really difficult thing to measure, particularly if you're trying to line it up against like the strategic plans, which simply don't come anywhere near using the same kind of language. And I think that's probably an issue we've found across the board.
Yeah, and it's actually something I almost forgot about, is that the the language across the academic papers, the patents and the policy don't line up at all.
Yeah.
And we tried very hard to find a way to compare at least the where academic research was and patents were lining up, and it was impossible. And we were only reassured by the fact that we found out that it was impossible for everybody. But I think that's a somewhat easier solution. In particular with patents, there's a very clearly defined structure in terms of how patents are numbered. And again, I'm probably getting the language a little bit wrong here, but that system is something that could potentially be replicated across academic research. And then some of the keywords can be pulled into policy documents.
It might be worth also just adding to that conversation. It's probably worth looking at the distribution of the quality of the patenting, because I suspect that hides a lot if we just look at that average data, because I think what your work shows is there's a lot more money in the patenting system, for example, in China. Whereas, in Australia, I've had 17 patent families, people who patent heavily. It gets very expensive very quickly, and you have to have very clear exploitation pathways for those patents. And so I suspect what you'd find if you analyse it is in Australia, on the whole, you think really, really hard about whether you patent, because you need to have a clear way of being able to support the costs of that patent. So I suspect there's more detail in the distribution data.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
I think we had another question down here.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful discussion this is. Thank you so much, and extraordinary research. Thank you for the work that you've done there. And also on the policy side, Louise, thank you so much, because I know that there is so much more underneath than what is being presented in trying to define those critical technologies. So thank you. My question is a bit multi-vectored, so I do apologise in advance. but it goes to the observation you made around turning research and innovation into capability. And you were mentioning how using mission is a fantastic way to drive that. And it certainly is from a 40,000 foot perspective. I'm very curious to hear, how this turns out in terms of implementation from a commercialisation perspective. And I'd like to offer a couple of observations, if I may be indulged. So you're talking about Starshot programs, and in defence, large programs like that, which are well funded and excellent and very interesting questions, and fantastic collaborations with universities as well in terms of driving research, are often, from a commercial perspective, driven through primes. Primes for defence are usually international companies, not Australian sovereign companies. And so then the primes will, from my observation, select which sovereign companies, if any, they would like to work with in order to substantiate their outcome for that particular program. And this has a sort of a shadowing effect on requisite diversity in the Australian economy around sovereign capability, because it's not entirely clear how a prime will make that particular selection. And usually it's a bit behind doors, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one vertical.
Vertical.
It is a large vertical. And so we see these problems of requisite diversity. So we have this fantastic policy, we have this fantastic drive to achieve, but then the conversion of that into capability, and we've noticed here in this research that that is limited in this country. There are many market forces that are driving that limitation. What can we do about that?
I'll have a first shot at that, but that is a much longer conversation, which I'm very willing to have. But just for the context of keeping it short enough for here, what you describe in terms of the role of primes and their role in sort of shaping contributors to larger programs is very much the reality for things like the Defence Integrated Investment Program and the big programs. And I think we've got to think, how do we disrupt the system so that in 5+ years, when we're making major acquisition decisions, there's a different array of choices, and that, Australian companies that might be quite, small to medium right now might, through some good policy support and some calculated risk taking by investment, get to the position of being able to build. So I'd make a couple of comments. I don't think we're there yet. We haven't got the magic solution. I think we've got a number of partly developed approaches that we need to just have the courage to try and test. Some of them are around new mechanisms for working early with industry and earlier TRLs, bringing them in before we entirely know what the solution is going to be, or whether, once we do, whether they will be the right partners to deliver it. So that's different procurement mechanisms, which I think is one part of it. Another is, if you look at Minister Price's sovereign industry capability plans, the SICPs, they articulate the aspiration about the areas we need sovereign Australian industry capability in. I think that's a nice counterpart to things like critical technologies in terms of setting aspirations for where we need to, I guess, put policy focus. So I think we've got some of the elements there, but I think what we need to do is have courage to experiment more with the mechanisms to come up with a greater diversity of ways we can partner early, trial, test, and accelerate. And we've got some seeds there that I think are really good. Things like we've got a rapid prototyping initiative where we can very quickly get engaged with an industry partner to test out an idea in a defence context. We've got the Starshot program. We've got the Capability Acceleration Fund, which was announced in last year's Force Structure Plan, but that hasn't yet kicked in terms of the financial aspects. So I think we've got a lot of the right ingredients, but ultimately we need the willingness to engage earlier, knowing we're going to have to stop some things, knowing we're going to have to disappoint people, knowing there's going to have to be some political courage at some point to say, this has been a wonderful program and these partners have been fantastic, but there is not a path to capability. And until we're able to do that, I think it's going to be very restrictive, our ability to partner early.
We are actually out of time.
Sorry.
So first of all, I would like to thank our panel today for a really, really interesting discussion. And again, Shiozawa-san, thank you so much for joining us from Tokyo. We've really appreciated your contribution. And I believe we have some afternoon tea. I'm not sure what we call it at this time of the evening. But please join us after this session. And again, we're happy to talk to all the attendees. But thank you so much. Thank you to our online attendees for dialing in today. And we'll hopefully talk to you soon. Thank you. It flew.
That went very quickly.